High Counselor stood rigidly at the command deck of the Celestial Dawn, his two hearts pounding beneath his chest. His reptilian eyes darted between the view screen and the nervous expressions of the ambassadors around him. They were all waiting, for doom or for salvation. Neither was certain. 13 ships had appeared on the edge of Union space, dark behemoths bristling with weapons. Vorik's long fingers tapped anxiously on the railing before him. The Drass had arrived. The Drass were not just another species. They were the stuff of nightmares. Vorik had heard stories of their ruthless campaigns across the galaxy, crushing civilizations, leaving only silence in their wake. They demanded tribute from entire star systems, and when they didn't receive it, they annihilated all in their path. Vorik swallowed hard. This was the moment he had prayed never to see in his lifetime. The moment where all the Union's carefully built diplomacy would be tested against the galaxy's most feared force. On the deck behind him, the 13 ambassadors of the Union of Planets were seated in a rough semicircle, their collective anxiety palpable. Each represented a different species, from the massive, bear-like Urgok to the pale, telepathic Thryans. All were leaders of their respective worlds, powerful in their own right. Yet today they were little more than frightened children waiting for a verdict. Vorik, as High Counselor, was supposed to guide them, but right now, he felt like he was guiding them straight into the jaws of oblivion. His gaze briefly rested on the newest member of their council, the human ambassador, Captain Mark Callahan. Humans were still a mystery to Vorik and the others, having only joined the Union mere months ago. Their entry had been controversial, brash, young, and seemingly undisciplined. Now, Callahan sat there, a faint smile on his lips, his posture relaxed despite the tension in the room. Vorik couldn't understand it. Was it arrogance? Foolishness? Or something else entirely? Vorik's thoughts were interrupted as the view screen blinked to life. The Drass flagship dominated the display, a jagged, dark ship that radiated menace. And then, the Drass commander appeared. He was tall and gaunt, his green skin almost luminescent against the darkness behind him. His angular face was impassive, yet his eyes, those eyes, bore into Vorik's soul, sharp and unyielding. Vorik forced himself to meet the Drass commander's gaze, though every instinct screamed at him to look away. Glorious and powerful Drass commander, Vorik began, his voice trembling slightly. We welcome you and are honored by your presence in these negotiations. The Drass commander did not move. His eyes flicked across the faces on the screen before settling back on Vorik. There was a long, agonizing silence before the commander finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. You may call me Commander, he said through the translator, his tone flat, unfeeling. Gracious Commander, Vorik continued, bowing his head deeply, we appreciate your patience and restraint. From the corner of his eye, Vorik saw Callahan smirk, quickly covering his mouth with his hand. Vorik glared at him, his warning clear. This was no time for irreverence. The Drass commander's eyes narrowed slightly. Enough. To prevent your annihilation, what do you offer the Drass? Vorik swallowed the lump in his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. The fate of billions rested on his words. He stepped forward, bowing his head once more. Greatest of the Drass commanders, as the head of the Union, we offer you the third arm of our home system, from the star known as Planus to the planet True. It includes thousands of mineral-rich asteroids, 35 planetary bodies and their moons, and a rogue planet. The commander tilted his head, the barest hint of disappointment flashing in his eyes. Next, he said, waving his hand dismissively. One by one, the ambassadors offered their tributes, planets, resources, even fleets of ships. Each voice quivered with fear as they sacrificed their worlds, hoping it would be enough to buy their survival. But the commander's response remained the same, cold indifference. He was unimpressed. Finally, it was Callahan's turn. Vorik braced himself, hoping against hope that the human wouldn't do something reckless. Callahan stood, his expression calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. Most noble and majestic commander, Callahan began, his voice clear and strong. He did not bow. Vorik's heart skipped a beat. How could he be so brazen? As the newest member of the Union, Callahan continued, We cannot offer you our controlled space or resources. Vorik's breath caught in his throat. What was Callahan doing? But, Callahan said, pausing for effect, what we can offer you is a big glass of shut the fuck up. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room turned to Callahan, wide with disbelief and horror. Vorik's hands gripped the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. This was it. This was the end. The Drask commander's eyes snapped to Callahan, his expression unreadable. Who said that? He hissed, his voice shaking with fury. Before Callahan could respond, every ambassador pointed directly at him. The human only smirked, stepping forward to face the commander on the screen. I did, Callahan said firmly, and I meant every word. The commander's gaze narrowed further, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Your translator suggests you intend to defy us. Is that correct? Vorik tried to intervene, his voice shaky. Gracious commander, I... Silence, worm! The Drask commander roared, his focus entirely on Callahan. Let him speak. Callahan met the commander's gaze without flinching. I don't just intend to defy you, he said, his voice rising with anger. I'm making it clear that under no circumstance will we bow to you. Not now, not ever. Vorik's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. It was over. They were all going to die. For a moment, the Drask commander said nothing, his face impassive. Then, slowly, a deep, rumbling laugh began to echo through the ship's speakers. The Drask commander leaned back in his chair, his laughter filling the room. Finally, he said, a wide grin spreading across his face. Finally, we have found you. Callahan blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. Found us? What are you talking about? The Drask commander's eyes gleamed with a new light, one that Vorik had never seen before. It was not malice, but excitement. We have been searching the galaxy for you, the commander said, his grin widening. A race worthy of standing against us. A race that will not cower in fear. Vorik stared in disbelief as the commander's words washed over him. This was not the reaction he had expected. Not at all. The Drask commander leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto Callahan. Tell me, human, he said softly, what do you think of war? Callahan, regaining his composure, smiled back at the commander. I think, he said slowly, that we've just found a new kind of game to play. And with that, the storm on the horizon shifted, not into war, but something far more dangerous. The High Counselor, watching from his fallen position, realized this was only the beginning. A thick silence hung in the air after Callahan's defiant words. The entire command deck was frozen, the other ambassadors paralyzed by shock, their eyes locked on the view screen where the Drask commander glared back. Vorik, still seated on the floor, couldn't believe what had just happened. This human, this reckless fool, had thrown the entire Union's survival into jeopardy with one audacious insult. The Drask commander's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer to the view screen, his sharp features illuminated by the cold light of his ship's command bridge. You mock us, he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. You think your pitiful species is above annihilation? Callahan didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed even more resolute. I don't mock you, he replied evenly. I'm challenging you. You've grown complacent, pushing around species too terrified to fight back. That's not power, that's stagnation. Vorik's heart sank. He had seen the Drask destroy entire worlds for less. His gaze darted to the other ambassadors. None of them dared to speak. They were as shocked as he was by Callahan's boldness. He wanted to stop the human, to beg for mercy, but he couldn't find his voice. Fear had swallowed his courage whole. The Drask commander remained silent for a moment, studying Callahan with a new intensity. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh, a deep, resonant sound that filled the deck. It was an eerie, unsettling laugh. But it wasn't the laugh of a man who had been insulted. It was something else entirely. You amuse me, human, the commander said finally, his laughter subsiding. For centuries, we have searched for a species that would meet us not with fear, but with fire. Every race we encountered bent the knee. We grew tired of their cowardice. But you are different. Vorik's mind reeled. Different? Was the commander genuinely entertained by Callahan's defiance? The very idea was incomprehensible. He had expected the Dras to unleash their wrath. But this was something else. Callahan took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the view screen. Then let's be honest with each other, he said. You didn't come here just to claim territory. You came here because you're looking for a fight. The commander's eyes gleamed, a dangerous light flickering within them. Indeed, he said softly, but not just any fight. We seek a true challenge, something that will push us to our limits. Your words suggest that humanity might be capable of providing such a challenge. The other ambassadors stirred uneasily. Vorik could feel the tension rising in the room. This was no longer a simple negotiation. This was something far more perilous. Callahan folded his arms, his expression unwavering. Then let's cut the theatrics. You want a challenge? We'll give you one. But not through war, not yet. If we're to prove ourselves, let's do it on terms that don't involve wiping out billions of lives. The Dras commander's smile widened, his sharp teeth glinting in the light. Interesting, he mused. And what, human, would you suggest? Callahan didn't hesitate. A contest of strength and skill, war games, if you will. We test each other, learn from each other. If we prove ourselves worthy, we stand as equals. If not, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Well, I suppose you'll have what you came for. Vorik's breath caught in his throat. Was Callahan truly suggesting they engage the Dras in some kind of contest? It was madness. And yet, the look in the Dras commander's eyes suggested that he was intrigued. The commander leaned back in his chair, considering the offer. Very well, he said slowly. We will accept your challenge, human. But know this, if you fail to impress us, we will not hesitate to crush you. Callahan nodded, unfazed. Fair enough. The view screen blinked off, leaving the command deck in an uneasy silence once more. Vorik finally found his voice, his throat dry. Captain, do you realize what you've done? Callahan turned to him, his expression grim but resolute. I've bought us time, Vorik. And now, we have a chance to prove we're more than just another species to be conquered. Vorik could only stare at him, torn between fear and reluctant admiration. Callahan had changed the game. But whether that game would lead to survival or destruction remained to be seen. As the command deck buzzed back to life with frantic preparations, Vorik couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The storm had not passed. It had merely shifted course. The human battle cruiser loomed in the distance, a hulking fortress against the void of space. Inside the command deck, the tension was palpable as preparations for the meeting with the Dras began. Vorik stood beside Captain Callahan, still unnerved by the humans' reckless defiance. Around them, Union representatives whispered anxiously, exchanging fearful glances. None of them could shake the gravity of what was about to happen. The Dras were on their way. Callahan stood unyielding, eyes fixed on the view screen. Vorik admired his calm, though he still feared it might lead them to ruin. Are you truly certain about this alliance? Vorik asked, keeping his voice low. Callahan glanced at him, his expression sharp but thoughtful. I don't trust them, if that's what you're asking, he said quietly. But I know this. We can't afford to be afraid of them. We have to meet them on their terms, show them we're not just another species to crush. Vorik sighed, rubbing his brow. I just hope we haven't overplayed our hand. The sound of approaching footsteps silenced their conversation. An ensign hurried over, eyes wide. The Dras commander's shuttle has entered the docking bay, he announced. His voice strained with barely controlled tension. Callahan straightened, his hands clasped behind his back. Let's welcome our guests. A short time later, they stood at the entrance to the cruiser's docking bay. The doors hissed open, and the Dras delegation strode in, towering, armored figures that radiated an aura of danger. Their leader, the Dras commander, stepped forward, his presence filling the room with a cold, lethal energy. The two groups faced each other in silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the air itself held its breath. Callahan broke the silence. Commander, he greeted, his tone formal but unyielding. Welcome aboard. The Drask commander inclined his head ever so slightly, his dark eyes scanning the room. Impressive, he remarked, his voice a low rumble. I expected something more primitive. Callahan smiled faintly. We're full of surprises. The commander stepped closer, towering over Callahan. So human, he said, his voice laced with challenge. You propose war games to prove your worth. A test of strength and skill. Callahan met his gaze without flinching. That's right. The commander's eyes narrowed, but there was a gleam of approval in them. Very well, he said. We accept your challenge. But understand this. Failure will not be forgiven. Should you falter, there will be no mercy. Callahan's gaze never wavered. We wouldn't expect any. The commander regarded him for a moment longer before stepping back. Then let us begin preparations. We will see what your species is truly made of. As the Drast delegation turned and exited the bay, Vorik let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at Callahan, who remained stoic. You just signed us up for a battle we may not survive, Vorik muttered, shaking his head. Callahan shrugged slightly. Maybe, he admitted, but at least we'll go down fighting. Vorik looked out into the void beyond the docking bay, a sense of unease curling in his gut. The Drast were deadly, relentless. This contest of strength could very well be their undoing. But Callahan had thrown them into the fire with the belief that survival lay not in submission, but in defiance. The fate of the Union was now bound to that dangerous gamble. As preparations for the war games began, Vorik couldn't shake the feeling that something far larger was in motion, something even the Drast hadn't anticipated. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. Vorik glanced at the communicator on his wrist. A coded transmission had arrived, a message from deep space, marked urgent. His heart skipped a beat as he read the brief, cryptic note. Greater threats beyond the void. The storm approaches. He looked up, dread coursing through him. If the message was to be believed, the Drast were only the beginning, and in the depths of space, something far worse was stirring.